Good evening, everyone. My name's Tim Kilduff. I consider myself, if nothing else, a cheerleader for the town of Hopkinton. This is a remarkable community, has been, currently is, and will continue to be. But you know, I wanted to, I'm here tonight to introduce to you two new historians. And I had to Google what historian really meant in sort of the elements that go into being a historian. Information gathering, interpreting and organizing information, reading texts, interpreting events, conducting interviews, visiting significant historical sites, developing coherent narratives, which we'll hear tonight, present findings, teaching, and lecturing. Chuck Joseph and Aubrey Doyle fit into those characteristics. One of the fun parts when we started looking at their presentation, they used the word collaborators. I don't need to tell you that not only Hopkinton, but the country needs more collaborators. But both Chuck and Aubrey are in fact collaborators. Their educational backgrounds are impressive. Both went to Brown, by the way. Chuck has a degree from Boston College, and Aubrey has a degree from WPI. So they both distinguished themselves in their particular careers, and they bring an interesting perspective. And by the way, if you ever want an interesting set of stories about Hopkinton athletics, you ought to call Aubrey. He grew up with that. And also did a pretty good job as a high school athlete, and then helped to build the Boosters Club. Chuck was introduced to Hopkinton as a teacher. I think you'll see some of that come out tonight in their presentation. He's also a successful business person, knows as much about real estate in Hopkinton as anybody that I know. But the presentation that you're going to hear tonight, there are some very, very intriguing elements that have gone into it. I want to make sure that I get the dates right. So you're going to be hearing about the town's history from 1620 to 1715, ending the year that Hopkinton officially was incorporated. But the intriguing part to me is you're going to be hearing a European version, but then you'll also be hearing an indigenous person vision. I think we forget the indigenous heritage that this community sits in the center of. I recently met some people who are ancestors. They're of the indigenous tribe that occupied this area. It was really fascinating because they have maps. That particular tribe has maps of the waterways all through this region, which was important to them in terms of not only moving out throughout in the region, but also developing the community. So this is I started by saying this is a unique community. It in fact is. I think the two collaborators are fascinating to talk to, but they have also exhibited an attention to detail that you don't often see. So from that perspective, this is unique. And I'm happy to say that this is being filmed tonight by HCAM, so we'll have a record of these presentations. They've already begun talking about additional presentations into the future, so the research continues. So from our perspective as a community, it is so important to be able to understand Hopkinton's, not only Hopkinton's history, but how it gets placed in the history of the United States, sort of the bigger picture. There's the macro and the micro, if you will. And I think we've lost sight of some of that. So it's a privilege to be here to listen to our new historians. The presentation this evening is being sponsored by the Hopkinton Historical Society, who has a big event, by the way, this coming Saturday. There'll be a display down in their facilities about Hopkinton sports, and also the Hopkinton Chamber of Commerce. So it is really fun and a pleasure to be able to turn the microphone over to who I now call Professor Chuck Joseph.
Thanks, Tim. Thank you, man. I appreciate it. Thank you, Tim. We're a unique town in the sense that we do have an individual chamber of commerce for a small town like Hopkinton. That doesn't usually happen, and we're very thankful for them. And of course, the Historical Society, we oftentimes think of dust and musty air when we think of historical societies. This place is cool, and they have been so good to me in terms of helping us get this research together. I can't say enough about Aubrey. I've known him since he was a senior in high school when I coached him. I know, I'm aging myself here right now. But he's a great collaborator, and he's a wonderful foil. So when I'm screwing up, he doesn't hesitate to tell me. And that really is helpful as we move along. I tend to move fast, so I'm going to talk fast. And I'm going to try to keep this to 1 hour. And I think I can. When we started we did one last year on the present, 1950 to the present. This year we've done the opposite, and we've gone back to 1500 to, well, we're actually hitting 1500 in Europe, but 1600 to 1715. And when I first got this topic, I said, nah, this is terrible. Who wants to talk about this stuff, right? But the more I dug into it, the more excited I got, and the more it was a challenge because we don't have a lot of written documentation. So we had to really dig deep on this, and Aubrey spent a lot of time in Boston at the archives and stuff, and really pulled up some great stuff. So with that, let me tell you what we're trying to do. Can we go to the first slide? We believe in the concept of big history. I am not really an advocate of dates and times and battles and how many guys got killed. Good for you. You learned all that. That's great. Wrote. I'm not into that. All right? Here's the belief behind big history. Immanuel Kant, back when he was around, talked about, he used the German word Weltanschauung, which means worldview. And he talked about how everybody has Weltanschauung. They have a worldview. Each person that I'm looking at here today, you have narratives in your head, many of them. You have narratives about your family. You have narratives about where you grew up. You have narratives about how the world began. You have narratives about the universe. You have all these narratives, and some of them are misinformed, but we still walk around with them. But every day, your narrative changes. Every day, you experience something else that causes you to tweak it a little bit. How many times do you catch yourself saying, I didn't know that? Now you got to fit it into the narrative. Well, that screws up my narrative. I don't want to know that. But that's what we're doing. And what we're saying here is with what we tell you today about this land. It's ironic for me to be standing in this auditorium because in 1999, I was on the committee that helped design this. So when I look around, I think, oh yeah, that was an argument. I remember that one, all right? But the point is that we didn't just land here. We didn't drop out of a spaceship and landed here. There was so much stuff that happened that we end up being at this moment in time here. And hopefully at the end of the hour, you're going to be able to say, I got some more stuff for my narrative. I got to figure out how to work that in. Okay? And that's what we're really striving to do here today. It's a unified account, and this is how it's going to work. Go ahead, Ab. How did we come into existence as a town, as a community? In some ways, we are unique. In some ways, we are not. All right? And we will cover both of those today. We go to the turmoil in Britain, which really was a big factor as to how Edward Hopkins got here and how we got here. We then talk about the long arc of the native history of this area. isn't colonists kind of a, when we get educated and we have history, people say colonists like it's a positive thing, right? Oh yeah, the colonists. Well, we're going to talk to you about that, all right? And then Edward Hopkins, a foot in two continents, because he really did. And it's a fascinating character, Okay, let's get going. All right, so I'm going to go fast. It's going to seem like, what has this got to do with anything? At the end, hopefully this thread will tie together, okay? Martin Luther. Martin Luther was made a priest in 1507 in Germany. He was an Augustinian monk. He was part of the clergy, and you must remember, this is a really important point. All of Europe, when you talked about the church, you were talking about the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church, the Holy Roman Empire, was a political entity, it was a military entity, it was a religious entity, it was all of those things. And all of Europe at that time, Western Europe, was a hierarchy. You had a hierarchy of politics, and you had a hierarchy of religion, and you had those two overlaying each other. So it's very much, you also have to remember that 80 to 90% of Europe was illiterate. Now think about that for a minute. Think about not being able to read. And how did you then learn things? You learned things through the oral tradition, which is what we are doing here tonight. You were completely reliant on those people who could read as sources of authority. And in those days, that meant the clergy. That meant the priests, the village priests, the bishops, etc. They were the keepers of the knowledge because they were literate. Literacy began to change a great deal in 1450 when Gutenberg, a metal worker in Germany, developed an alloy to be able to make movable type. And he created what we came to call the printing press out of a wine press and this movable type and better ink and all that other stuff. And what's the first thing he prints? The Bible. So he is printing what for most Europeans was the most important book in their life. But they couldn't read it unless they learned how to read it. So you have a technological innovation in the printing press, which leads to Gutenberg, which leads to Luther 60 years later, looking at this hierarchy with the Pope and the tremendous power and how concentrated it was, and disagreeing with it as a priest. Disagreeing with God's spokesman on earth, the Pope. The Catholic doctrine says that the Pope speaks ex cathedra. He speaks from the chair of Peter. He gets a direct line. So you don't question that. You do not question that. And Luther questions it. And Luther goes to the church doors and nails on the 95 Theses, questioning the church's authority. He did it through the means of indulgences. Indulgences were where the Pope allowed you to give him money and you could get a get out of purgatory free card. Pretty much, that's kind of what it was. You could get absolution through money. It didn't make a lot of sense to Luther. And he says, hey, no. And the Pope goes nuts and says, oh, no. You don't question the Pope. In 1517, he nails it on. In 1521, he's excommunicated. He's kicked out of the church. He's a priest. He's kicked out of the church. He will die as an excommunicated Catholic in 1546. In the interim, he continues his movement to reform the Catholic Church, and he protests all of these things. So he becomes a Protestant or a Protestant, and his reform movement becomes the Protestant Reformation as we know it. And it begins to spread to other sects, Calvinism and Congregational Church. All these begin to take the Pope to task. And this is not going well. It's creating a lot of turmoil in Europe. But I'm going to argue with you today that Luther's one of the most significant characters in Western European history, not only because he started the Protestant Reformation, but also because he gave permission to people to question all authority, political, religious, etc. So you had a hierarchy in the Catholic Church, but you also had a hierarchy in every monarchy in Europe. So everything is hierarchical in structure with illiterate people at the bottom, and who are gaining literacy, and who are all of a sudden, Luther opened Pandora's box. And he said, you can question anything. If you can question the Pope and church, you can question anything. Okay. So that takes us to 1509, somewhere in there, in England, and the second of the Tudor kings. Henry VII was the first. Henry VIII is the second. Henry VIII, so at that time, it was very common for kingdoms to try to marry their children to one another in order to create a dynasty, a dynastic rule. So Henry of England marries Catherine of Aragon of Spain with the idea that these two countries would be a powerhouse if they got together, and all she has to do is have a son. Because it's also deigned through the divine right of kings that God appoints the king. And that family, if they have a son, he also is appointed to be the next king. And it's so funny how even today, in modern day, we take it like, oh, okay, that makes sense. No, it doesn't. That does not make sense. But that's what happened. And so Henry and Catherine have a daughter, Mary. And then she miscarries 2 children, but she never has a son. And Henry is concerned that the dynasty, the Tudor dynasty, will not move forward. So he goes through his clergy and he says, go to the Pope, who's the head of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is the religion of England, and tell him I want a divorce. The Pope says, no. No can do, Henry. And so Henry goes, okay, you're out. I'm the head of the church now. I am now the king and the head of the church. I am the head of the Church of England, which we know as the Episcopal Church. This doesn't go well with a lot of Catholics in England. I don't want to get into this because, man, you can get down a rabbit hole here, all right, with Henry and the next 5 wives, all right, and the beheadings and everything else. But the fact of the matter is, Henry dies in 1547. His only son, I think Catherine Parr was the mother, I can't remember, was only 9 years old. So he becomes king, but they have a Lord Protectorate who runs the country while he's growing up. It's not going so well. So what happens here is that you have that Protestant Reformation, which had occurred. You have Henry saying, well, I'm now a Protestant church. I just happen to be the head of it. And then, but it's still the Catholic Church, and all of its trappings, and all of its ornateness, and all of its richness of celebration of formality. And these Protestant groups, the Lutherans, and all these other people are saying, no, you need to tone that down. You need to make the churches less ornate. You need to simplify. It can't be a top-down structure. And some of these people we came to know as Puritans. The Puritan was not a religion. It was an all-encompassing term for some of these other groups that were all together. And they are trying, within the system of England, to reform the church. So, let's continue. Oh, when we first gave this speech, you guys know the library, and you know that half of it used to be St. Paul's Church, right? The fieldstone half of it, as I say. And it's a great little room to talk in. It's a wonderful room. But if you haven't gone in, you should go in there. Just sit there. Because that was Hopkinton, our Church of England. It was our second one, all right? It was built in the 1890s. And it's now down on Wood Street. St. Paul's is down on Wood Street. That's our next lecture. There's a whole piece of that that's really funny. But the point is that this isn't divorced from us. You know, it was fact, when we do our next talk, which is going to be 1715 to the American Revolution, we get into the fact that the British wanted a Church of England here. They were real concerned that these Congregationalists were getting out of hand. And we'll talk to that a little bit later. Okay. So there you have a map of Europe. You've got the Holy Roman Empire. You've got France. You've got Spain. You've got all these. You know, we were kind of taught the British version of colonialism. We didn't really talk too much about the French version or the Spanish version, which were earlier and more significant than the British. But it was happening simultaneously. And we're going to talk about everything that's happening simultaneously because there's so much crap going on in England that they're kind of not paying attention over here. It's like, yeah, you guys do what you want. Just send us money and stuff. And that was kind of how it was working out. Go ahead. So in 1492, under the flag of Spain, an Italian mariner named Christopher Columbus discovers San Salvador, I think it was, in 1492. And all of a sudden he says, hey man, there's a lot here. And the kings and queens of Europe are starting to say, okay, we got to put our claim in. We got to go do this. So ironically, in the 1490s, this guy on the right, Pope Alexander VI, issues a series of bulls, B-U-L-L. And a bull was a proclamation from the Pope. And he issues these series of bulls. Now, you got to think about this. Their religion was way more important to them than most Americans feel today. This was real serious business. And the Pope says in these bulls, if you are a Christian explorer and you go to a land that is not occupied by Christians, you have every right to take that land in the name of the Christian nation you came from and to do what you need to do to the people there to subjugate them. The Pope gave his blessing to this. You now, as a Catholic conquistador or British or Frenchman, you've got the good seal of approval to do whatever you need to do when you get here. Your religion says it's okay. Ex cathedra. It struck me as kind of odd when I read that. I said, man, that's a big document. And then I figured out and found out that Alexander VI was Spanish. Columbus had sailed for Spain. And he actually divided the world up and said, this is all Spain's. And you other guys can have something up here. So you have to understand that it's politics, it's finance, it's religion, it's all wrapped into one. Okay. So in the colonization, this is kind of a cool little map here. Do I have my little doobie here? Yeah, I think I do. Let me see if this is working. Can you guys see that? Yeah. Okay. So this is the story we get. That's Britain. All right. They kind of got the East Coast wrapped up here, but they don't really. The Dutch are here and some others. And then this purple is all France. So France basically, through Cartier and those, come down the St. Lawrence, and they're here about 100 years before Plymouth. All right. They're in the fur trade, man. They are in the fur trade, and they're doing it very seriously. And then you got kind of no man's land that gets split up here. But this is the part that we really don't pay attention to, which is the Spanish. So the Spanish come in through the islands, and they come up the west coast, and of course California and all that is all Spanish there. And they were particularly violent in the conquistadors, etc. Okay. So the European road to New England goes like this. Go ahead. There's the religious turbulence, by the way, when the Puritans come over here, we're always taught, well, they came here for religious freedom. I remember reading that, hearing that. Yeah, they're religious freedom. It is not the religious freedom we think about. Religious freedom to them meant that they could practice their religion. It was not religious tolerance. So if you were not of their faith, Roger Williams, Thomas Hooker, you're out of here. There was a group in Hopkinton, Presbyterian, Scotch-Irish, and the Congregationalists didn't like the way things were going between them. They booted them. They booted them out of town. Said, you're out of here. And the Presbyterians go, okay. So they pack up and they go to Western Mass, and they found a town called New Glasgow. Did you ever notice all the news we have here? New York, the New England, by the way, in the literature that we read, the diaries of these colonists, they don't refer to New England. They refer to the New England, the New England, the New Hartford, the New Braintree. All right? And it makes sense. What are you doing? Well, we're going from our old one and we're coming to the new one. So we'll just call it that. Go ahead. Political instability, the instability that we'll get to in Britain, really has a lot to do with how this country gets formed. The maritime advances, I don't think we talk enough about this. I don't think we're taught enough about the advances in astrology and the woodworking advances that cause these ships to become sleeker and faster and lighter. And you know, it kind of went like, they went from the Iberian Peninsula, Lisbon and Spain, they kind of bounced down Africa until they got around the Horn of Africa. And then the ships got better, and then they said, well, let's go over to Newfoundland. And Newfoundland, you know, of course the Vikings hit Newfoundland too, like 500 years before that, but they didn't stay. But there's a lot of work with Newfoundland. We'll come back to that because it is hard for us to imagine how big the fishing industry was here. And I mean the fishing industry like, come here, fish, send it home, bring it home. All right, way before we were colonized, like 70, 80 years before. Go ahead. So the age of exploration and colonization. Colonization just substitutes the word imperialism, all right? But that's what it was. It was like, okay, we're gonna go somewhere else and take their land, and we're gonna claim it for ours. Okay. That's kind of what happened. Go ahead. But the biggest thing that is sometimes not emphasized enough is the role of the emerging economic principles of capitalism. The fact that there was capital to invest in these ventures to go colonize. Massachusetts Bay Colony, Plymouth Bay Colony, they were corporations. They were stockholders who expected a return on their investment to be sent back. We don't talk about that a lot. We talk about turkeys and corn and stuff like that. But there's a lot more going on here. Go ahead. So the Pilgrims land at Plymouth. Now the Pilgrims were an extreme group under the name of Puritans. They had been, they were separatists also. They were not so much about reforming the Church of England. They were more about, nope, we got to start all over again with a new church. So they end up going, I think it's Leiden in the Netherlands for a couple of years. Then they're not making it there financially, so they just say, look, we might as well try this new place. So they convince a bunch of London stockholders to form a corporation and send them to Plymouth. And so that's what happens. They come over on the Mayflower. There's 102 of them. About 34 of them are pilgrims. We don't really know what the others are doing there. We know like 35 of them were the crew, but there were servants on there. There were people coming for political gain. There's all kinds of motivations. I think it's too simple for us to say, this is what happened, A, B, C, D. You know, when I think of the history of Hopkinton today, December 3rd, 2024, there are 20,000 different versions of the history of today in Hopkinton. Every one of us has our own version. You can't know all that. All you can do is pull the summary statements out and think of your narratives now. You have narratives in your head, and we're messing around with those narratives a little bit today. And that's okay, because you'll process it and you'll incorporate it and you'll figure it out for yourself. Are we there already? Okay. You guys have, you remember you used to put your fingers on a paper draw, make a turkey for Thanksgiving and do all that stuff. You guys heard about Squanto? Yeah, Squanto was the Native American who supposedly helped the Pilgrims get through the first winter, et cetera, et cetera. Let me tell you a little bit about Squanto. His name was Tisquantum, and he was a member of the Patuxet tribe, which is where Plymouth was. And he was captured by Thomas Hurd, a lieutenant of John Smith. And he was enslaved along with a bunch of other indigenous New Englanders. And he was brought back to Spain to be sold. And he was sold. And then some European Catholic priests rescued him or purchased him, we don't know exactly, but a few of them were purchased. It was their intention to convert him and them, and to teach them European ways, which they did. Somehow he bounced around, and this is the thing, when you're doing this kind of research back then, you don't get the whole story. But he bounced around, ends up in England, and then somehow he gets hired by the Newfoundland Corporation. There was a corporation set up to go own Newfoundland, all right? And he hooks on with those guys, And he comes over and they're fishing, and the fish is unbelievable. The cod industry back then, I have this vision of you throw a net in the water, you get a bunch of cod, go on shore, make friends with the local indigenous people, salt your fish, and go home. That's kind of what happened. All right? So there's communication and there's contact pre-1620 between the indigenous folks and the fishermen, mostly from the Basque region, and also the fur traders. So 1620 is not the first time. All right? There's a lot more going on, and it's not organized, and it's messy, and we don't really know everything that happened. Squantum, whose name was Tisquamit, ends up in Newfoundland, and I love the way they say this in these little narratives. They say, and he found his way to Maine. Yeah, how do you find your way to Maine when you're, all right, so anyway, he finds his way to Maine. And so he was kidnapped in 1614, and he doesn't get back to the New England, which he doesn't know is the New England, that's his home, in 1619. This is not Squantum. This is not Squantum. But it was the only photograph I could get of an indigenous American. This guy's name was Thomas Molarino. He was a Native American in the 1880s, and he was schooled at the Carlisle School for Native Americans in Pennsylvania, and he was anglicized. And so that's how he looked before and after. And I just thought that was a thing. But Squantum comes back. What's our next slide? I just want to see what it is. Nah, that's not the one I want. Go one more. No, okay, we'll get to it later. So Squanto learns English, and he comes back, and I'm going to tell you what happens when he gets back in 1619. He's gone, I don't know, some people said 10 years, some people said 5 years. I don't think anybody really knows. But he's Europeanized, and he comes back. Okay, let's go to the next one. We put this up as an illustrative timeline. When we're taught the history of the United States, we're taught only the British side. This happens to be a timeline of Africa and America, but you can see how there are simultaneous events going on. And one of our goals here today is to say that, yeah, we all learn the story of the pilgrims and colonists, et cetera, but there's all this other stuff going on in Spain and France and England that has an influence of what's going on here. It really does have an influence. Go ahead. These are a map of the inhabitants of New England, our area. Let's fly in a few names, if we can. Are we able to fly those in? Yeah. The Mohican or Mohegan, the Nipmuc, the Niantic, the Pequot Mohegan, the Massachusetts, the Wampanoag, the Narragansett. These are all names that are part of our culture. They're here. We say those words. We don't know what they mean. We don't really even connect them to the indigenous people anymore. It's Nipmuc Regional. It's a high school. That's all we know. Massachusetts. What does Massachusetts mean? Those of the Great Hill. What hill? Blue Hill. Oh yeah, Blue Hill Reservation. You start tying these things together and they mean stuff, but they don't mean stuff to us because we weren't taught that stuff. These red paths that you see here are the indigenous people's trails. We're going to come back to this because a lot of our non-interstate highway roads are traveled over these same trails. And these trails often went from body of water to body of water because that was what was important to them, how to get from fishing to drinking water to water. Go ahead. This is a map that Ob pulled up, which is really great. It shows the watersheds. A river creates a watershed from where it is. So you have the Blackstone watershed, the Charles River. The Charles River, by the way, was noted in the original Massachusetts Bay Colony Charter that King James gave and said you could have from the Merrimack River to the Charles River. That was how they identified areas. So these watersheds were really important, and this is the Nipmuc, what they call the Nipmuc country. Go ahead. Okay, purple from green, purple background from green, meaning we're going to the indigenous side, okay? From the European side, you've got to go from their religious roots, the Bible, which said that God created man and he gave him dominion over the earth. Genesis 1:26. He gave him dominion over the earth. Dominion. Dominance. The earth would exist to serve man. It is endemic to that religious belief. I would argue it's endemic to what we have as American culture today, that belief. The indigenous people had a different view. The indigenous people felt that man was an actor in the play of nature, but only an actor. And man had to think about and coexist and support the animals, the plants, the water, the sun, everything. We were a player. And they thought of themselves as being stewards of the land versus the European concept of ownership of land. Now, people say to me, well, the indigenous people used to fight too, they used to go. Yes, but they fought over use of the land. Where would they have hunting grounds? Where would they have fishing grounds? What was going to be their territory to use? But none of them ever conceived that a human being could own Mother Earth. And that's a source of a problem with the clash of these two cultures. On the right, one of the things I didn't know, shame on me, is how great they were in New England. I'm talking about New England indigenous people now, how great they were as agricultural farmers. If we read the diaries of the first colonists that were here, and we'll get to that in a minute, they talk about the plantations that they found. 20, 30 acres of cornfields. Now, we don't think of that. We always think of them as hunting in the woods, right? And that's what they did. Oh, yeah, they pick up berries, too. They were serious farmers. They would slash and burn the forest, burn the underneath out, get rid of all the underbrush, even burn some of the larger trees down, get it cleared. They would farm it, and the three crops that are indigenous to America, potatoes, tomatoes, and corn, we introduced that to the rest of the world, those three products, to the rest of the world. And they grew them here. On the right-hand side here, you'll see, and if any of you have read Braiding Sweetgrass, the book that was pretty popular, all right, it talks a lot about the three sisters, all right, the three sisters of agriculture, corn, squash, and beans. All right, the corn would grow, the beans would use the corn and grow up, and the squash would keep the moisture in to keep them all safe. That was very much a real thing. But I think I would like to just emphasize the spiritual and religious beliefs of these indigenous people and the contrast to what they experience coming over, because that's fundamental. Go ahead. This is just kind of an idealized painting. But there is some merit to this. They did have these long houses or bark houses that were, basically bent green, and they didn't have nails. By the way, they had to use rope and twine and stuff. And they would have bark. That was their winter home. And then they would often go close to the water, the river, where the better soils were, and they would have a lighter home, not as durable, that they would stay in the summer while they farmed there, and then they would go back into the valley, into the log homes for the winter. And this cracks me up. The kids, you couldn't give them an iPad. You couldn't just say, hey, go sit in the room with your iPad. So they would build these platforms, and the kids would be human scarecrows for the fields. And they would just scare off the crows and the deer and everybody else. Imagine doing that all day, But it actually was a thing, so anyway. And of course, in the winter months and so on, they were just expert weavers. They had to create these binding ropes and sashes and things because that's how they did everything. All right, and there was one colonist who wrote, they made miles of this in the winter from reeds and things. Go ahead. And of course, the importance of water. Now, one thing I want to say about waterways, they did not have, indigenous New Englanders, did not have any beasts of burden. They had no oxen, they had no horses, they had no donkeys, they had none of that. And of course, I'm thinking, well, how do they get stuff around? Like big stuff. And it was probably on the water, which is why those waterways were so important to them. But every road that we're going to talk about, and we're going to talk about a few in a couple of minutes, there were no horses, there were no wagons, there were no oxen, there were no donkeys. It was on foot. Everything was on foot. So that to me is amazing, and I'll speak to that in a little bit. Go ahead. And these are some of the early trails. Is this the, yeah, this is the Great Trail. So this is the Great Trail, which ran from Boston to Hartford. So you can, if you guys have any kind of map skills, I don't know. But you go from Boston and you come out this way and you go right in front of what is Town Hall today in Hopkinton. All right, that was the old Connecticut Path, or the Great Path. And then you go down through Upton, Mendon, Webster, Dudley, and you make your way down to Hartford. And that was called the Great Trail. That was a big deal. And it came through here. But everything was on foot. And I'm trying to think, how long does it take to walk from Hartford to Boston? I don't know. Okay. The pre-colonization we talked a little bit about in terms of the fishing is the one that gets me, is especially along the coast of Maine, there was a lot of European fishermen who would land year after year, make friends with the indigenous tribes that were there, and learned to exchange languages as well. And in fact, one of the guys who ends up going to Plymouth, I don't know how he does this either, but Samoset, who was from southern Maine, had learned English through these fishing expeditions. And he was one of the guys who communicated with the early Mayflower people. But I want to know, how did Massasoit know how to get Samoset? Like, do you just say, hey, go find me one of our guys that talks English? I don't know. I don't know how they do that, all right? But he ends up coming down. There's so much we don't know. Go ahead. 1619. Remember, Squanto is in Europe. 1616 to 1619 is what is referred to as the Great Dying. In 1615 or so, the indigenous population of New England is about 100,000, somewhere in there. And again, these are estimates. The Great Dying wiped out 80 or 90% of the population. 8 or 9 of every 10 people died in that 4-year period. To give you a matter of perspective, we recently have experienced COVID, and no single life is less worthwhile than any other, but we lost 1/3 of 1% of our population. They lost 80 to 90%, 3 years leading up to the colonists coming to Plymouth in 1620. There are so many accounts of these colonists who talked about coming and finding vacant plantations that they could just move into and take over, and the human remains were still on the surface because there were not enough people to bury everybody. I have a hard time wrapping my head around that. I have a hard time if you consider the concept of PTSD and you say, it was a 6-state PTSD. These people must have been just in shock. If I gave you and said, give me a list of 10 people at your house for Thanksgiving, and now scratch out 8 or 9 of them, that's incredibly powerful. I will tell you this, when James Stewart of England, writes the charter for Massachusetts Bay Colony, he makes very specific reference to God's hand clearing the way for the Puritans to come to New England by wiping out the savages with these plagues. It was God's hand and God's will that he was clearing the way for us to come here. It's in the charter. So sometimes when we think about this, it's hard to get our arms around what we were taught versus this. Because there are two sides to the story, and they are quite different. Squanto, remember Squanto? He made his way back to Maine. In 1619, he finds his way back to Patuxet, Plymouth, Massachusetts, where his people were, and they were all gone. every one of them. There wasn't a member of his tribe left. This guy was enslaved, brought to Europe, fought his way back, got down the coast, comes back for a reunion, and they're all gone. Everybody's dead. He doesn't know what to do. So he connects with the Wampanoags, who are the next area over. And the Wampanoags have a sachem, which is a chief, have a sachem named Massasoit, Massasoit Community College, right? These are all part of our lexicon. They're where we are. Massasoit's not his name. It's not his name. Massasoit was the Indian word for great sachem.
Thank you.
His name was Wanameset. We only know him as Massasoit. It's like saying mayor. It was his title. But that's how it comes down through history. All right? That's what we get. So Squanto, unfortunately, European educated to a degree, indigenous by birth, is not accepted by either side. He's not trusted by the Wampanoags, and the Pilgrims at Plymouth don't know what to make of this guy. In fact, Massasoit won't send him in for a while because he doesn't trust them. But after a while, he said, okay, you go in. And Squanto ends up living with the Pilgrims in what the English redubbed Pawtuxet as Plymouth. So he lives with them there for 3 years. And he teaches them how to grow 3 sisters. He teaches them how to care for their fish, how to salt their fish. So he is an important person. And William Bradford, the governor, takes to this guy a great deal. And they become fast friends. And it's on a trip where they say, Squanto, can you take us around Cape Cod and show us the shore? And he becomes deathly ill and he dies. Squanto dies on that trip. So we're at this place now where the colonists are here. It's really important for us to understand that these are corporations that came here. Yes, they were people coming for religious freedom, etc. But they were corporations. And they came with the notion, with 350 or 400 years of British common law, which outlines everything that we know today as property rights. You can get a deed, you can survey land, you can sell that land, you can own it. Go back to the indigenous people. How could anybody own land? How can anybody own land? And the British are here and they're saying, oh yeah, we're going to take that land. You guys okay with that? Go ahead. So the significant factors is the devastating pandemic. I just can't tell you, I don't even know. I just can't imagine it not being. Some of the colonists were writing that this shook all the spiritual beliefs of the indigenous people, which made them open to accepting the monotheistic beliefs of the Christians who had come here, because they doubted their own belief system. Go ahead. The stewardship of nature. You know, I don't know how to speak to the dynamic tribal relations. I've been reading a lot about them, and I don't know, man, it's really hard to kind of figure out who was who and powerful here. And then you mix in that some of the indigenous people were allying with the colonists to get advantage over other indigenous people, and it's just a hodgepodge. It's like, I don't know who to trust if I'm an indigenous person here. Go ahead. So in Europe, when we were taught European history, these are some of the people we learned about. We learned about the Ottomans, the Greeks, the Romans, the Germanic tribes, the Franks, the Celts, the Iberian cultures. That's what we were exposed to in our education. But what we were not exposed to were the Olmecs, the Zapotecs, the Mixtecs, the Toltecs, the Mayans, the Incas, and the Aztecs. Most of us know the last 3, but we don't know the ones before them. These are not tribes. These are civilizations, sophisticated civilizations. Europeans called this the New World. New to who? The indigenous people had been here 25,000 years. 25,000 years. Older than Europe. Go ahead. We're familiar with Paris, and in 1500, Paris had 225,000 people. Naples, 125. London, 100. Venice, 100. Florence, 60. What we did not learn about was Tenochtitlan with 250,000. Texcoco at 150,000. Cuzco at 60,000. Tikal, Chichen Itza. I have been to Machu Picchu. I have been to Cuzco. I have seen those civilizations. We didn't exactly have a leg up on these guys. But we're not taught this. Go ahead. In the Corriental irrigation system, one of the engineers said, a lot of people look at Native Americans in the Western Hemisphere as not having the same engineering or technological muscle of places like Greece, Rome, India, or China. But when it comes to water management, the Mayans were millennials ahead. You know, Tenochtitlan in Mexico, which is now Mexico City, estimated 250. There are other estimates that said up to 400,000 people lived there. That blows me away. They were built on lakes, and they were like Venice. They had canals, and they had these massive pyramid structures, etc. They had a phenomenal water system that would bring clean water to the neighborhoods. When I was in Machu Picchu, which is on a mountaintop, and I don't even want to go into the stone carvings and things like that, but through the center of this little village, and you're just going up and down. It's you and the llamas. You're just going up and down all day, right? There was a little rivulet into basins of water coming from the top all the way down, stopping in each neighborhood and leaving a basin of water in the 1400s. So, you know, it does, we talked early on about a narrative. We all have a narrative in our head, and maybe we alter that narrative just a little bit. Go ahead. All right, so we got to get a little closer to home here. Edward Hopkins. Edward Hopkins was in 2 continents. What do we got up there? Okay, so that's Hopkins on the left. So let me tell you a little bit about Hopkins. Born in 1600, pretty wealthy family in Britain. He gets a ship, and he starts, in his 20s, he's trading with Turkey. And he's doing very well. And I'm thinking, what the heck is this guy doing trading with Turkey? Well, it turns out his uncle is the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. Okay. So he's going back and forth. He's doing really well. But he is a Puritan. He is a Puritan. And he stays in England till about 1630, when he's about 30. And then he makes a decision, because in the 1630s, we'll find out later, that the Stuarts, who come after the Tudors, are cracking down on all the Puritans. And a lot of the Puritans are saying, okay, we got to get out of here. We're gone. And so Hopkins, do I go the whole way with this part here? I'm trying to remember. I think I do. Yeah, okay. Hopkins comes over, lands in Boston. Hopkins is good friends with John Winthrop Jr., Governor John Winthrop's son. He's in the Puritan Mafia, all right? He's right there. And so there's all these connections. And so Hopkins gets to Boston, but you know, that's okay. He decides he's going to Hartford. So he goes down to Hartford, and there's no moss settling on this rock, all right? Begins this trading empire going up and down the Connecticut River for beaver pelts and everything else. And meanwhile, he's sending his ships back and forth to Britain to bring the supplies to the people who live here. This dude is doing very well. He becomes the governor of Connecticut. Edward Hopkins, Hopkinton Town, becomes the governor of Connecticut. But Connecticut has a new compact that says you can only be governor for 1 year. So this other guy and he swap out for like 12 years. First Finn, then Hopkins, and him, then Hopkins, and him, then Hopkins. All right? And he's amazing. The guy's amazing, right? And he's got this empire here. But he's very nervous. I think I may be jumping the gun. No, where are we? Okay, good. Every once in a while, I got to see where I am. He's very nervous about the indigenous people and their threat to the colonial expansion. So from Hartford, we know he goes on foot to Boston at least once or twice. Now, I used to always say Edward Hopkins never set foot in Hopkinton. I'm not so sure. It was Magunko. It wasn't Hopkinton. It was Magunko. But he probably passed through here, or pretty darn close to it, as he made that trip back and forth. That's kind of reassuring, you know. He didn't stop, I don't think he opened a restaurant or anything, but he went through, and then he goes back. Okay, where are we? Go ahead. We're back in England. Green, that means England. The Stuarts take over. So let me just think for a second. Go to the next slide, Ob, if you can. No. Yeah, that's the one. That's the one I want. Okay, right there. So fly that in. So that's Edward VI. That's Henry VIII's son. He was a 9-year-old who kind of, you know, he hits 16, he becomes king, but he dies like a year later. And then the great Queen Elizabeth I takes over. And she rules from, I think it's 1547 to 1603. She's a Protestant. There's still a lot of Protestant Catholic going on in England. It's not over yet, all right? And she was a masterful diplomat. And somehow she was able to keep the peace for almost a half a century. Now, she was also a politician. She gave here, took here, gave here, took here, but she kept the peace. She also defeated the Spanish Armada, all right? So this is not a woman to be messed with. Elizabeth I was the real deal, and she keeps it going. But then she croaks, and let's see, she dies, and then Mary, no, Elizabeth, oh, then it's the Stuart dynasty. Then we get James and Charles I. Those two guys, they're clowns, but they you know, they kind of make it work for a while. But they're messing up left and right. And they don't do very well as kings, but they do drive the Puritans out. They basically say, nope, we're not going to be tolerant. We're not going to do this. You're going to have to abide by, you know, what is it, the King James Bible, you know, all that stuff. We're going to do this. So that's when, that's Mary. Yeah, okay. Yeah, Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, Catholic, tries to come back and reinstitute Catholicism. Doesn't work. She kills a lot of people, though. It was violent. I mean, those times, I don't think we really understand the violence of those times. You know, it's mind-blowing sometimes. But, and it's Bloody Mary, yeah. So anyway, the Stuarts are there, but they're screwing up. Charles River, named for Charles, all right. Jamestown, James, okay. So what happens is there's this, remember we talked about Luther questioning authority and trying to bring down the church and how that was going to bleed over into government and politics? It bleeds over. And this guy named Oliver Cromwell begins his rise in Britain. And he comes up through the military, and he's a tremendous military guy, to the point where he dethrones the king. And the age of British republicanism takes place in the 1650s. The king is gone between Charles I, when he gets executed, and Charles II, when he gets the restoration later on. I don't care about any of this, except for this. Hopkins is in Connecticut. Edward Hopkins, our Edward Hopkins, the Hopkins School. He's in Connecticut. He goes back to become part of Cromwell's government, this Republican government. We have nothing that shows a relationship between them. We have no idea what that relationship was. Why did this guy, as governor of Connecticut, leave, go back to London, and become the admiral of Cromwell's navy and gets elected to Parliament? He is simultaneously the governor of Connecticut and a member of Parliament. No idea what that relationship is. He had to have been a closet Republican. And there had to have been some communications going on for him to up and go, I'm governor of Connecticut. Hey, I got to go. Why? Ooh, Cromwell. You know Cromwell? I'm not saying. I mean, you know, it's all kind of mysterious as to how that all happened, but it is very significant. So 1653, he ends up back in England. He gets elected Parliament. He's running the Navy, blah, 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 and he dies. Unexpectedly, 55 years old. He dies. So, okay, He has a will, but his will says it will not be enacted until 6 months after his wife dies. I don't know if he knew anything, but that's what he wrote. His wife lives for 40 years. Her last name is Yale, from Connecticut. She's not from Connecticut, but the Yale family that we know. So, am I at the will yet? Keep going. Let me see where I am. Oh yeah, I got to go back to this. Sorry, I'll get back to that story. So back in New England, in 1620s, you guys, do you know what we call the Massachusetts House of Representatives and Senate? You know what the formal name is? The General Court. The Great and General Court. Pardon me. The Great and General Court. Well, the General Court existed in the 1620s and 30s, right? And Aubrey and I are going, because Aubrey is, do you have those deeds? Can you run to those deeds for a minute? Well, these are the early Massachusetts towns: Plymouth, Salem, Lynn, Boston, Watertown. All right? These are in the 1630s. They've only been here a couple of years. And I said, how are these towns being formed? Who's forming them? All hell's breaking loose back in England. They don't care what's going on here. Who's saying you can do this? Well, it's the General Court. And I said, what's the General Court? The General Court was the corporate entity of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It's an inside job, guys. Now understand, we talked a little bit about the tenuous relationship between the indigenous people and the colonists, or imperialists as some people call them. And the colonists are saying, okay, you got those 40 acres. You got those 50 acres. Private property ownership, foreign to the indigenous people. What do you mean they have this land? What do you mean they own the land? How can anybody own land? Well, because we said so. Well, who are you? We're the Great and General Court. Can you understand the confusion in the indigenous people? Now, there's another part to this private property piece. Go ahead. Oh, yeah. These are the early Massachusetts towns. Do you see how it exploded? It just exploded to the point where the indigenous people are saying, what's ours? What part of this is still ours? We were here 15,000 years. You guys have been here a month, and you're doing this. So what happens now is this, Aubrey went into the land court, and he found deeds in Hopkinton granted by we're not a town. We're nothing. We're Magunko. And they're granting these 40 acres, 500 acres, 155 acres. So these people are getting deeds saying, you own this land. And the indigenous people are still trying to wrap their heads around this. Now they're getting pissed off because these guys are bringing cows and sheep and beasts of burden with them. And these cows and sheep are eating the crops of the indigenous people who are trying to grow their three sisters. And the indigenous people are saying, hey, you can't do this. And the colonists are saying, well, fence your land in. And they're like, fence? Land? You can't own land? So you see this cultural, can you feel how this must have been an incredibly confusing time for everybody? But it was becoming clear, that this, I don't know if they can coexist. There were people trying, but could they actually coexist? So there was how many was it, 12, something like that? There were 12. So there's a Puritan minister in Roxbury, Massachusetts, who has his congregation there named John Eliot. Many of you may have driven down Eliot Street in Natick. That's John Eliot, all right? And he decides that we've got to convert. We've got to start converting some of these indigenous people. Now remember, there's only 10 to 20% of them left after the pandemic. Don't forget that. And he's converting some of them and saying, if you become a Christian, all right, if you decide to do this, then. So he develops 12, what they call the Natick praying towns, or the praying towns. And we were one of them. We were Magunko. and us in Ashland. And right in the center of town, where our common is, there was a group of 55 praying Indians that lived there. And they had pigs, and they grew corn, and they were converted. But what was their mind about? What did they think? What did they think conversion meant? How did that work? And there were many of them. I actually grew up on Packagug Hill outside of Worcester, and that was another praying town. So there, and Grafton, was it, how do you say? Hassanamessa, Grafton. So these things were here. Now that's causing stress within the indigenous communities. The Christians, non-Christians are not, it's not going real well. There's a lot of difficulty there. So this tension is growing between 1650 and 1675. And the indigenous, so you remember Massasoit, Wanamesset? He dies. He's the sachem of the Wampanoags. And his second son, Metacomet, takes over. And Metacomet is pretty sophisticated politician. He gets the idea and he says, okay, you can't take our land. You got to get out of here. And he actually goes to the colonial courts 3 different times, goes into their system and tries to win possession of those lands and gets denied 3 times. So he really thinks the fix is in. He's like, there's nothing we're going to do to get our land back. And there's only one thing we can do. We got to go to war. And so he goes throughout New England and gathers as many indigenous warriors, and there aren't many left, as he can. And his anglicized name is King Philip. And that was the beginning of King Philip's wars. And they were awful. They were awful. I don't want to go into the description of all of them, but a lot of people were killed on both sides. A lot of people were killed. Inevitably, the indigenous people were defeated, and the colonists won. And the indigenous people will never come back as a rival strength again. That was the time where it's like, okay, it's over. It's now full force colonization straight ahead. Okay, go ahead. So Edward Hopkins, we're back to him. Remember he died, he left a will. I don't mean to say it's comical, but it's kind of funny because he's dead and all his trustees are dead. So there's nobody to execute the will. Right? He's got this will, and he had a pretty fair amount of money. His wife dies, so it goes into the legal system in Britain, and they're going, I don't know, we got to find somebody to do this. So they appoint this trustee group, the Edward Hopkins Charitable Trust Group in London. And in his will, I'm not going to read you all of this, but in the top part he says, I'm leaving some money to educate young men, because nobody was talking about women getting educated back then, young men to be in the service of government of the country in future times. Okay, kind of a public service element to this. But then in the bottom, he goes on to say, and I'm leaving a bunch of money so that, which in the simplicity of my heart are for the upholding and promoting the kingdom of the Lord Jesus Christ in these parts of the earth. Go forth and spread Christianity, was basically what he was saying. And here's a bunch of money to go do it. So that group in the court system said, well, that must mean training ministers. We got to train ministers to go spread the word of God in the New England. And there's only 2 places in New England that you can train ministers, Harvard and Yale. So Harvard and Yale enter a 10-year battle over the money. In 1700. As always, Harvard wins. Harvard gets the money. And they're saying, okay, how are we going to educate these ministers? Because we got to supply these towns, because in order to become a town, you have to have a minister. How are we going to do that? Well, we'll buy a bunch of land and we'll go back to the feudal system and we'll rent it to farmers, and with those rents, we'll pay for the education of these ministers. Okay. How are we going to get land? Let's go to the general court. So they go to the Great and General Court. And one of the liaisons to the Great and General Court is a guy named Reverend John Eliot. Eliot goes to the Natick praying Indians and said, we got to find some land for these guys. And they say, oh, go to Hopkinton. Oh, no, they say, go to Mugunko. So they go to Mugunko, and they're offering to buy what we know today as the majority of the town of Hopkinton. It was not, Mugunko. And the Mugunko tribe of the praying Indians says, no, no way. We're not selling you squat. You're out of here. And 2 weeks later, the Natick praying Indians overrule them. And the group from the General Court in Harvard go to Natick, and some of the Mugunko representatives go, and they sign the document to sell what we know today as Hopkinton to Harvard University. There are 5 or 6 indigenous people that sign this document. 3 of them can only make a mark. They don't have literacy to be able to sign. 3 of them you can make up. And then as I'm reading through the account of the trustees of the will of Edward Hopkins, they go through this whole thing, and then they say, and the next day, one of the signers, and they name the indigenous person, hung himself. Nothing else. No explanation, no nothing. So why? What was going on? We all can speculate. We can all figure that out. But I think it's important to note that there was still this stress between the indigenous people and the colonists about how to treat the land, can we live together? How do we do that? 3 years after that, before we go to this up, 3 years after that, the General Court of Massachusetts granted an incorporation to the town of Hopkinton in 1715. If you go to our town hall, you look at the 2 windows, 1715 and 1904, I think, when the town hall was constructed. They're above the windows, etched in stone. So if you forget, you can always go there. Right? That's how we came to be. That's the story of how we came to be. Okay, so in this session, we've taken you from the time of the landing of the Mayflower in 1620 and the introduction of European colonists into the indigenous area of New England, up to the incorporation of the town of Hopkinton for the university at Harvard in 1715. That's been a nice trip. It's an interesting one to take. And we're going to be telling you a little bit now about our land and the whole purpose of what we do here. Some of you hike the trails in Hopkinton, and there's one particular trail from down by the reservoir over to Saddle Hill Road. A lot of history in there. It's called the Duck Pond Trail. And I've been hiking this trail for 25 years. Same trail, never the same hike. And one of the things that I did was, in looking through some of our old maps, in a map from 1831, it showed this trail on the map, and it said, Old Indigenous Trail to Westboro. And that got me thinking now about how long and who walked this trail. Why did they walk this trail? Because there were no beasts of burden here. So there were no horses, there were no oxen. So the indigenous Nipmucks who lived in this area walked everywhere. Did you bring stuff to someone over by Fruit Street, what we know as Fruit Street today, and bring it back to Indian Brook over this way? I don't know, but I encourage you all to get out, walk your land, know your town. So we ask ourselves as we do these history series, why are we doing this? What's it all about? And the answer is one we always give, because this is what we do. We think it's important that we know about the place and the land that we walk on. And we've now taken ourselves up to the incorporation of this community called Hopkinton. And in June of 2025, we'll be doing the next in this series, which takes the town of Hopkinton from 1715 through the American Revolution. And the reason this presentation is so exciting to us is that we are one of the few towns who have all of our original town meeting notes, handwritten. And we have a great team of researchers who are transcribing all of those notes as a basis for that presentation, so that we not only review what's going on in Massachusetts Bay Colony, what's going on in the area that would become known as the American colonies, but what was going on in this town of Hopkinton. We look forward to seeing you then.